I've got my next batch of resin mixed, and at this point all I'm going to be doing is grabbing a toothpick and drizzling epoxy into the shiny low spots just to fill them out. Now the bulk of the low spots are obviously going to be on the back side. However, I'm going to focus on the front first because it's the most important, and then when I'm done with that, I'll work on the back. For some reason, that cured way too quickly in the cup. I wasn't able to get the 30-minute working time out of this. Kind of disappointing, but oh well. I took both steering wheels outside and gave them quite a bit of sanding. Did a bunch of contour sanding around this one. And then the other one that was a little further behind, I went ahead and did the same thing you saw me do to the first one with the Dremel cutoff wheel and sanding drum. And then I'm going to go ahead and epoxy it up just like I'm going to do with this one. But my primary focus is going to be this one. And this should be the last epoxy that I do on it, or so I hope. It's been sanded to perfect smoothness, so all I really need to do is give it a little touch up with epoxy, and hopefully that will be the end of the epoxy phase, and I can just move on to where I do like maybe a final light sanding and then hit it with a clear coat. Alright, let's do this. This is the other carbon fiber wheel that I've been working on. It benefited from some of the lessons learned off the other wheel that's a little further ahead. Key way that it's better off is because when I first did epoxy and I had all the excess carbon fiber sticking out, instead of just doing a thin epoxy, I went ahead and added more epoxy and made it thick so that once I ground off all the excess carbon fibers, I was also able to do the first contour sand and get it up to shape. That was a bit rough on me just because I did sand into the carbon somewhat, which ended up with carbon fibers in my arms and it itched like crazy. So key detail, don't sand into carbon fiber. It itches in ways that you will not believe. It feels like a million needles stabbing your arms. It won't mess up the pattern really in this particular case. It all looks exactly the same, and once I epoxy it, you'll never know that I sanded on the carbon. But yeah, just don't do it because of the issue with the fibers being extremely itchy. Now, while I did do that, unfortunately, this one did suffer through some damages to the carbon with me sanding through it in a couple spots. So like here and here, I've gone through. And I thought to maybe just take a paintbrush and paint those areas black, or I'm trying something different than what I did on the other wheel. But in this case, I'm thinking maybe I'll just take a little square of black vinyl and apply it to each one of those sections. These are high temperature vinyl sheets, and I'll just make little squares, put them there, and epoxy over it. I'm also thinking of doing a red stripe here using red vinyl. So let's go ahead and try that out and let's see how that turns out. Maybe a great idea, maybe a terrible idea, but we'll find out. Alright, so let's tuck that down. So first thought is this stands out a lot. Like, it's very, very visible that there's this weirdo black patch that doesn't match. So I don't know if this is gonna work out for me, I think I'm gonna go ahead and glue down carbon fiber like I did the last time. Definitely in like small areas you can probably do a repair like this, but nothing too large or it becomes very, very obvious and glaring. I got myself some red vinyl. I'm going to go ahead and set up a little center line. This I'm kind of gonna just eyeball. Alright, so what I'm basically gonna do is gonna use the hole in the center of the steering wheel to just kind of eyeball this over. Alright, now just need to epoxy on some carbon in a couple spots. Maybe use some low spot filling. Here is the other wheel that had what was supposed to be its final coat of epoxy, and I've now learned my lesson about trying to do thin coats of this resin. This resin does not like to be thin coated. It pulls apart in certain areas, gives you very poor coverage if you do that. So I'm going to have to, unfortunately, do yet another round of sanding on this thing and then do a thick coat of epoxy in order to get it perfect. Looks pretty good until you zoom in. Right, there are some very small defects. I'm not sure I'll be able to catch them on camera, but you can kind of see like little pinholes where the epoxy didn't fully cover. Another issue is I had some little hairs fall off the brush and get stuck in there, which means sanding some more, and I've actually bought some more expensive brushes this time to clean this up and make sure that that doesn't happen to me. So here comes another round of sanding. Alright, this is my secondary wheel. I've already gotten it to a stage where it looks pretty good. I've got the epoxy well over the vinyl stripe, so you don't really feel transition. And it's looking very nice, but of course this is going to need a lot of contour sanding to get it perfect because it's still in that kind of wavy phase, much less than the other one was originally, because I started off contour sanding this pretty early. So I can probably do one contour sand on this and then do epoxy and basically have the final coat of epoxy done, such that I can then just do the bit of a finish sanding in order to get clear coat on there. And that's actually what I'm going to do next on this particular wheel. Then on this one, I've sanded and it's all contoured and ready. It literally just needs its final epoxy coating and it's done. While the steering wheels are sitting down in the garage and drying up, I figured I would talk about the electronics for a little bit. So carbon fiber and flat bottom shaping the wheel has taken the bulk of this video series up, but it's not the only thing I'm trying to do with the steering wheel. The reason I chose this version of the 3-spoke Toyota wheel is because it has steering wheel buttons. Now these were used for the E-shift transmission, and I don't have an E-shift transmission, right? I have a manual. The reason I chose this is because the E-shift buttons, however, allow me to create steering wheel buttons, for example, for volume and changing tracks, which is what I want to do here. Now, I took these apart, and it has an integrated structure for holding the button. It's very difficult to cut this up and install a larger button setup like I originally intended. So what I'm thinking of doing is I'm still going to 3D print my own buttons, but this time around they're just going to be made to fit inside the housing. And now what I've done is I've gone and ordered up a bunch of these little PC boards, and I've ordered a bunch of these tiny little buttons. I couldn't find buttons small enough to do what I wanted, so I realized that I would need the type that you use for a PC board. And that's these little guys. So these guys I'm going to solder on and cut this board and install it on the back side of this. Of course, I'm going to have to cut out all this plastic and 3D print a new housing for this little structure. But once I do that, I can go ahead and I can solder the cables that went to this button to one of these tiny little buttons, and then the ones that went to the button on the back side of the steering wheel to the other tiny button. That way, instead of having one button in front of the wheel and one button behind it, I can have two buttons in front. So I'll have my volume up, volume down, and then on the opposite end, I'll have a, previous track, next track setup. So I'm going to go ahead and solder these to the board and then cut this, followed by soldering the next row and cutting them as well, so that I can build the board, and then I can take measurements in order to design the little 3D printed housing that's going to go in here and give this the dual button setup. And while I'm at it, once I'm done with doing all of that design work and building the buttons, I'm going to of course wrap this and the buttons in carbon fiber to match the rest of the steering wheel. Also, the airbag cover for these wheels, I went ahead and took these things out and painted them black. I also poured resin inside this 3D printed Toyota logo. So that looks pretty good. I gotta tweak the technique a little bit to get it perfect, because this needs to be laying on a level surface when you pour the epoxy, and the surface was a little bit less than level, so it's not a perfect bubble the way I wanted it, but I'll get there. And I'm going to go ahead and take this off. I'd painted it black already, but now I've decided that I'm going to take it off and wrap it in carbon fiber to match all the other details. So I'm going to go ahead and do that as well. Here's a close-up of the resin emblem that I did for the wheel. You can actually see the 3D printed texture on the silver portions. You can't see it on the black because of the epoxy, but because the silver stuff is shiny, you still notice it. The next one I might actually sand so that you don't see any 3D printed texture whatsoever, and then I'll paint the silver followed by the resin coat, and that'll probably make it look a little bit more commercial. Remember that another little electronics detail that I'm working on is on having a steering wheel mounted push start button. Now this is a Volkswagen, Audi, etc. push start button, and it has multiple connectors on it. Now 2 of them are for the button, right, the switch itself, so when you push the button there's continuity between them, and I'm assuming the other 2 might be for lighting. So I think that this button probably lights up, but I'm not 100% certain. If it does light up, I'll likely leave it silver. If it doesn't light up, I might also wrap this in carbon fiber and then put a decal over it that says start. Otherwise, I'll leave it as is, because it would be cool if it lights up and you can see it. But I have to find out. And then I also would have to find out how I'll get power to the button since it's steering wheel mounted. I do have enough connectors for the switch portion of it, because I'm going to be reusing the leads that were being used for the cruise control. Since again I have a stock for cruise control mounted on my column, I don't need one on the steering wheel. I completely eliminated that and used this setup to mount the button in its place. More likely than not, I will, regardless of anything, wrap this black portion in carbon fiber, and that'll just keep the theme cohesive, right? Then the only things that won't be carbon fiber will be leather. So I've got this wheel sanded. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in all of its low spots, but I'm really just going to epoxy the entire thing, and I'm probably going to do 2 coats on each of the steering wheels just to get them finalized. I think that if I do 2 coats here, I can fill in those spots plus flatten it out. And on the other wheel, there are no low spots left, so it's just going to be a matter of adding epoxy and filling it out so that it's thick enough that I'm happy with it. Then I'll do a final sand and clear coat. Alright, so while I wait on some epoxy to dry, I'm going to go ahead and start soldering these buttons down to the little PCB board. Now, I could not find my soldering iron. A lot of stuff that I still haven't unpacked since I moved. However, my micro torch does have a soldering attachment, and I was able to find some solder at my local big box store. This is 100% not the right solder for this. You want something much thinner. It's a little bit thick, but I'm gonna go ahead and take a stab at it. I've kind of spaced these buttons out where I want them to be on the board. I took the original button from the steering wheel and just kind of like messed with it, and tilting it back and forth, I'm able to click each one of these buttons without any issues. So now I know that more or less that's where I want them to be spaced wise. So I'm gonna go ahead and start soldering these guys in. So probably just lay this down like that. And I'll actually pop the ones on the opposite end, and that'll actually help hold the board in place while I do this. That one came out ugly. There we go. Those are now soldered on. Not going anywhere. Very nice. Super cockeyed, but that doesn't really matter too much. You can always twist that a little bit. Even though my setup is less than ideal, as you can see, output of this is not too bad. These are the buttons that go to the wheel and the requisite wiring. I'm going to go ahead and cut off these two wires here and solder them on to the button. Then I'll cut off the wires from here, solder them onto the opposite button. This is the back button. And I'll do the same for the opposite side. Alright, there it goes. Currently have a holder, I'm gonna kind of use my wire stripper to pin these down. I'm gonna go ahead and do a continuity test just to check that the button was working. So basically when I press the button, I expect to hear tone, just like here when I touch these two together. So put this on one lead, put this one on the other. Let's push the button. Yep, we have continuity. Button works as expected. I assume the same for the other one, unless they were manufactured poorly. Right, soldering something to it really shouldn't make a difference. I need the little alligator clip things that hold stuff for you. Yep, works as expected. So now I'll solder the other side and then go ahead and cut down these boards. Now I did see someone online cutting this with some tin snips. I intended to cut it with a Dremel, but I'm kind of curious about the tin snips. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Let's see if I can do it without damaging anything. Ah, cuts like nothing. That's good to know. I don't need this extra here either, so I can go ahead and cut that off. Probably not ideal. I think my Dremel would have done a cleaner job, but it is what I need it to be. So I can't complain. Alright, looks like we're at soldering time. Alright, that part of the board is done. I'll go ahead and cut it I wonder if this can cut this stuff. Wow, it can. Just obviously this is not a continuous blade, so it won't give you a cut all the way across. This stuff's actually pretty easy to cut, I'm surprised. Thought it would be harder for some reason. Alright, so now I've got these things soldered up with 2 little button pads, and then I can start designing and 3D printing the little button that's gonna go in here, and it's basically gonna give me 2 little buttons, right? I'll have this split in half, so one will be volume up, volume down, track, next track, previous track, etc. This stuff will come in from the back like that. You'll be able to press down on it with a little 3D printed button. I've sanded down the steering wheel, and the other one has all of its low spots filled in. So now I'm going to go ahead and start doing like final epoxy coats on both of these things. I'm planning to just do a thin coat on each one, come back in 2 hours, do another thin coat, come back in 2 hours, do another thin coat. And that way just build up a nice thick coat of epoxy with minimal sagging, dripping, running, etc. I've now also got a spray bottle full of acetone. Shout out to the homie Hawaii Carbon for giving me this awesome tip. You can spray acetone on the epoxy and that will remove bubbles off of the surface. So mahalo to him. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go ahead and implement that right now. And let's go ahead and get some epoxy mixed and get started. Now another thing that I'm going to implement is I've got 2 cups now. I'm gonna mix my resin up in this first cup, then pour it out into the other cup and finish mixing it there. So I'll probably do like the full 3-minute mixing here, do an extra minute in that, and then I'll hit it with a torch. This is also a container of hot water as I've been doing. I've had good results with doing that and the torch combined. The reason you would pour into another cup, I was seeing on the Easy Composites YouTube channel, is that oftentimes you have resin in the corners of the cup that is unmixed. So by pouring it out into another cup, you kind of just guarantee that you get an even mix on all of it. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do this time around. Alright, let's start putting this onto the wheel. I would really love to move to a resin system that just doesn't require this. And this part sucks. Like I get it, it's a reaction, it's going to bubble up, but it'd be nice if I didn't have to deal with so much of it. So it's actually been about 4 hours. Steering wheel is looking pretty good. So I'm going to mix up another batch of epoxy and do the second coating for both of these steering wheels. Alright, here comes the second wheel. I found one of these foam things. Alright. Pray that this goes well. Alright, it's the next day and both of these steering wheels are looking pretty good. This one I allowed to have some drips because it's not its final epoxy application. However, on this one, it is a final epoxy application. So what I did was I rotated this thing back and forth as it was drying, and I continuously hit it with a torch in order to cause the epoxy to cure faster and reduce the amount of drips that I would get. I still do have a very mild dripping along the back, but you see it's kind of a perfect even ridge as opposed to a whole bunch of little dots. So I'll just be sanding that off. This will get sanded up to 400 grit and then get hit with a clear coat, and the carbon fiber on this one is done. This one I will remove drips and do some more epoxy, followed by the same process of sanding to 400 and adding a clear coat, and this will also be done. I love how that red line looks in there. It's just so... it's like way deep in there under the epoxy. The camera can't even get it properly.